a lot of Costa Rica's success on forest cover hasn't been emulated in terms of active rewilding. That's what I'm trying to start the wheels turning in Costa Rica is, when do we need to use maybe more of an active approach?
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World with me, Ben Goldsmith, and I'm sitting here with Andy Whitworth, who's the director of Osa Conservation in Costa Rica. Andy, my brother Zach is a huge fan of Costa Rica. I think he originally introduced us, and he's very, very excited that we're speaking today. Thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be talking.
Andy, Costa Rica is fascinating because it's one of the few countries in the world to have dramatically increased its forest cover in recent decades. Now, I understand that Costa Rica went down to about 20 or 22% forest cover in the late 80s, early 90s, and then the government decided to build an incentive scheme for landowners with less productive land to allow the forest to recover or even to plant trees. And I think the number, I'm sure you'll know more accurate than me, but the number is somewhere back up at around 50 or 60% forest cover now.
Yeah, I think it's around 53%. So, and it was kind of the combination of the establishment of a national park network, which stands at over, on terrestrial surface, there's well over 30% of the land cover is now under official protection of some form or another. And then obviously the incentivization schemes have seen that forest, has recovered.
Andy, but before we talk about Costa Rica and specifically about Osa itself, how did you find yourself there? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in the northwest, not far from Manchester, Oldham and Rochdale, so as further from tropical rainforest as you can get. I grew up in a pet shop. My dad had a pet shop in the northwest in a place called Oldham. And so I was always connected to wildlife. So I studied zoology, and as part of a master's course in conservation biology, I went to Tanzania, and that was the first time I'd seen real wilderness. In the UK growing up, I didn't get exposed to it. I thought the Lake District was, the wild areas. So when I went to Tanzania and I saw Arusha and Tarangire, I was like blown away by what real wilderness was, what, these big apex predators and big game species. So I just did anything I could to get a job anywhere in the world in a rainforest. So I managed to bag myself like a field assistant job in this really remote camp in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So I spent about 9 years down in the Amazon region, and I did my PhD down there through the University of Glasgow in the Peruvian Amazon. And I was kind of working in field stations and conservation, working around in indigenous communities, studying biodiversity, and got connected to this guy, Adrian Forsyth, who wrote a book called Tropical Nature in, I think, like 1984, pretty much the year I was born. And so I met Adrian, and he asked me to come to Costa Rica and come and visit the Osa Peninsula. And I was kind of a bit snobby at that point, because I was like, why would I go from the Amazon to any other kind of rainforest anywhere in the world? But when I stood on the coastline, down on the beach in Osa, and you see this vast rainforest where the Pacific Ocean meets it, and it's a completely undeveloped coastline. I'd never seen anything like that. And so it just drew me to that part of Costa Rica.
Can you just orientate me a bit as to where Costa Rica is and where the Osa Peninsula is?
So Costa Rica is kind of smack dab in the middle of Central America. It's on that isthmus of the land bridge between South America and North America. And the Osa itself is on the Pacific coast, but it's on the South Pacific. And it's this kind of, it was an island at one time. It's been an island in geological history, but it's this little kind of island peninsula in the Southern Pacific.
And why has Osa managed to escape large-scale agricultural or built environment development? Why is that coastline unbuilt?
Well, it almost didn't. I mean, when they first made Corcovado National Park, I think in I think it was the late 70s, early 80s, that was the point where the invasion was just about beginning, really, into the Osa. And the reason that Osa was saved is that it was just so remote and wild. Essentially, there were no roads down there at that point that invaded the peninsula. So the lack of infrastructure really meant that the agriculture hadn't taken a hold and taken over. So its remoteness is what really saved it.
And but it wasn't uninhabited. I mean, who was in the peninsula already at that time?
Well, at that point, really, it was really just the first pioneers came in probably in the early 1900s, but at that point it was pretty much uninhabited. We find there's these huge stone spheres from lost cultures, basically, that we don't know who made them, and there's no descendants from that culture there today, and so most of the people in the peninsula are not. There's no indigenous culture there. There is an indigenous group that's moved in, but a lot of people migrated there to basically land grab in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And a lot of the people's descendants actually came in from Panama at that time.
And just so we get a feel for the size of Osa and the Corcovado National Park as compared with Costa Rica altogether, it's not a big country, is it?
It's not a big country. It's a relatively small country, and Corcovado Park itself is 40,000 hectares, which sounds big, but it's relatively small. I mean, there's farms in Brazil much bigger than the whole of the peninsula itself, so it's not a ginormous landmass. But despite that, it's got an incredible amount of the world's biodiversity in this tiny area. It's extremely intense and rich in biodiversity, both plant and animal life.
So is the Osa itself is part of Corcovado National Park?
Corcovado's part of the Osa Peninsula. So Corcovado National Park is on the peninsula. And then just on the mainland, there's another national park, much smaller, called Piedras Blancas, which is around 15,000 hectares. And then up in the mountains, you've got the big national park, which is the Amistad International Peace Park that runs from Costa Rica into Panama. And that is a vast wilderness of highland oak forest. And then there's these kind of series of biological corridors that connect these three linchpin national parks in the Southern Pacific.
So Osa is not isolated in natural terms. It's connected by corridors, and wildlife can move north and south and down into the peninsula from the wider Mesoamerican region.
I wish it was that way, and that's the way it should be. I would say that the connectivity is pretty decent between the two lowland parks, between Piedras Blancas and Corcovado. There's this thing called the Reserva Forestal Golfo Dulce, and that's really well forested and well conserved. And there seems to be really good free flow movement of most wildlife species. The problem is from those lowland areas to the mountains, there is a big agricultural landscape, mostly beef and cattle farming. And one of our main projects is to actually increase forest cover in those farms, work with farmers and try and improve the amount of forest cover in that agricultural matrix.
Yeah, because I once visited the peninsula further north, the Nicoya Peninsula, which has some lovely undeveloped forest. It has some secondary forest, presumably as a result of those national policies that Costa Rica implemented in the early 90s. And then it's got quite a few cattle ranches. And if those cattle ranches were here in Britain, you'd say they were pretty good. You know, the whole NEP rewilding story in Britain tells us that the combination of low intensity grazing by livestock with scattered trees across a semi-open landscape is kind of manna from heaven, or rocket fuel, Isabella Tree calls it, for wildlife. So when I was in the Nicoya Peninsula and I saw these dotted kind of trees across a semi-open cattle grazed landscape, I thought, well, maybe this isn't so bad. Was I right or was I wrong to feel that way?
It really depends what we're talking about. And this is what's challenging with biodiversity conservation in general. I mean, there's a mad rush right now to develop these biodiversity metrics about what's good and what's bad. And it really depends what we're trying to do. So, for example, if we look at the peninsula itself, if we go back to the 60s and the 70s, and the place was being ravaged at that point by gold mining, the invasion of agriculture, a lot of the wildlife species were almost extirpated. Like the surveys in the 80s show that most of the wildlife was confined to Corcovado National Park. There was very little outside. And I'm talking about most groups, even, collared peccaries and packers and pumas. But we ran a big camera survey around 4 or 5 years ago. We gridded the whole of the peninsula, like 220 cameras and lots of different network partners. And we actually found that almost most species had recovered, like incredibly well with the establishment of the conservation areas. So we now get like pumas and collared peccaries all over the Southern Pacific, even in that agricultural farming landscape. So even where the cattle farms are and you've got those trees, you'll still get some of those generalist species. But what you won't get are things like white-lipped peccaries and jaguars. So some of the apex species that really represent our most pristine habitats and our real wilderness areas, they still need big contiguous blocks of forest that is largely undisturbed.
And will those species move back into secondary forest? With all those cattle ranches through Nicoya and other parts of Costa Rica that have gone back to forest during the last 20, 30 years, do they create habitat that's suitable even for those more sensitive forest species?
Well, what I think that they can do is provide more like either stepping stones or habitat that kind of provides a corridor for an animal to move. It might not support populations where there's enough food base that they're going to like spend a lot of time and reproduce there, but they might at least be able to move from one area to another, like as a passageway or a corridor, which is still really important from the idea of relatively isolated populations being able to mix genetically. So those landscapes are still hugely, hugely important, even if they can't support, say a giant population of something.
But in Osa, you've got some lovely intact forest and big stretches of pristine primary forest, you'd say. As the director of Osa Conservation, what's your mission? What's your plan for that part of Costa Rica? What are you doing?
That's a great question, and I think our mission has kind of changed, or it's evolving from 20 years ago when, at that point, I suppose it was about stopping species loss due to things like gold mining and poaching, which those problems have really kind of reduced enormously with obviously with the payment for ecosystem service schemes, but also the ecotourism economy that's developed. But the truth is that we still lost a lot during that crash of Costa Rica's forest cover in the 20s, down to 20%. Around 25 years ago, giant anteater and harpy eagles, for example, were basically extinct from the country. Every now and then everyone will get excited because a vagrant, harpy eagle will fly in, maybe from Panama or from Guatemala, but that doesn't mean there's harpy eagles back in Costa Rica right now. So they've been largely absent, and we lost things. Even if you look at like our particular region, even species that haven't gone extinct from the country, they're still absent from some of the national parks. So the white-lipped peccary that you can see in Corcovado, huge big herds of these things that really shape how an ecosystem functions. You can get herds of over 100 of them roaming around together, and it's the principal prey for jaguar. They're completely gone from Piedras Blancas National Park, and they haven't made it back there in 50, 60 years. And so a lot of Costa Rica's success on forest cover hasn't been emulated in terms of active rewilding. Everything that's happened with wildlife has pretty much been passive at this stage. And so that's what I'm trying to start the wheels turning in Costa Rica is, when do we need to use maybe more of an active approach?
And exactly the same debate, of course, is happening here in Britain, where we've got growing numbers of acres that are in rewilding and active habitat restoration, but which are missing species that, even when the habitat's perfect, won't come back by themselves. It's what Derek Gow talks about so often. And it's not just the charismatic species, the lynx, the wild boar, the beaver, ultimately perhaps the wolf. It's smaller species here in Britain, such as the harvest mouse or fossorial water vole, pool frogs, redback shrikes, twites. And this country's been really, really weak so far in terms of its ambition on species reintroductions. So have there been successful reintroductions or translocations of these kinds of species in Costa Rica? And if not, is the country gearing up to do it or to allow you to do it? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
That's a great question. So there has and there hasn't really. So I would say it's more serendipitous. So there are these big success stories, say, of scarlet macaws, that their populations were probably extremely low at one time. And through rescue centres, maybe receiving birds that have been confiscated from the pet trade, or an injured bird, the government really doesn't know what to do with them. So they'll often allow them to go into rescue centres, and then rescue centres will usually plan some kind of release. And so that's happened because of that reason. It didn't stem from what you're saying about, look, we have this lost species, it's really important for ecosystem function, let's proactively do it. It was more of like, well, we've got to deal with these birds that we've got, and so let's do something with them. So we're starting those conversations. So our team just went with a couple of members of the local government down here to actually visit Rewilding Argentina and go and look at what was going on down there to kind of inspire them about, what can be done in terms of proactive rewilding. So we're now at a point where there's a new management plan being developed for Piedras Blancas National Park that actually incorporates active wildlife release as part of its management plan. And so there are these kind of long processes and steps that we need to go to because these things haven't been done before. But the first one that we're kind of taking on and we're trying to push forward is a translocation of white-lipped peccaries. So we know we've got a bunch of white-lipped peccaries in Corcovado. Their populations seem to be at least stable. And the best way to acquire some is to take some from a nearby population and move them to a place where they haven't been able to, get to in 50 years. And they can't get there probably because of their ecology. They go around in these giant herds. And so a barrier like a road is actually a huge barrier for an animal like that.
Can you just describe for me what a white-lipped peccary looks like?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a wild boar. They're related to pigs, so they kind of look like a wild pig. But peccaries are also different to pigs slightly. And so there are two species that in our region. And one is the collared peccary, which is kind of small, and they go around in little groups. So you'll say maybe 8 to 10 together. And so they can recover pretty quickly. And they're really appreciated by pumas. So you get a big puma population when you get a lot of collared peccaries around. But the white-lipped peccaries are like twice the weight of a collared peccary. They've got these huge teeth, tusks that they clack together. And they go around in these huge herds. In the Amazon, we'll see like herds of over 300. And it's like there's an earthquake going on when you encounter these things. It's incredible. And that's really what jaguars prey upon. They're ambush predators, and they follow these giant nomadic herds around, and they'll pick off, weak ones or injured ones through ambush. But they're really dangerous. Like they could turn on a jaguar and kill a jaguar.
Just like a wild boar in Europe is dangerous for hunters and dangerous for predators. And presumably these peccaries, both kinds, are essential ecosystem engineers, just like wild boar, in that they turn the soil and they transport species around, seeds and so on. So when you miss these species, the forest is diminished quite substantially.
Exactly. I mean, they essentially determine what's going to grow and what isn't, right? So if a tree seeds and those things come through and like hoover up 99%, they're going to determine what survives. There was this study in the Amazon by this guy, Harold Beck, that actually found that peccaries actually are the animal that engineers a lot of the breeding pools for amphibians. So a lot of frogs depend on these peccaries making these kind of temporal pools in the rainforest, and that's it was a really interesting link of what a role that they play in the ecosystem.
So on your list of species which you'd like to see reintroduced not only to your patch but to other parts of recovering forest in Costa Rica, you've got the white-lipped peccary. You've talked about the harpy eagle, which is a really big eagle that hunts monkeys, if I remember right.
Absolutely, yeah. They specialize on. They'll pick off sloths, so anything that's an upper canopy animal, but especially bigger monkeys like spider monkeys and howler monkeys.
What sort of size is one of these eagles?
Oh, they're huge, like stud tall. Like they're probably like 1.5, something like that, with almost a 2-meter wingspan. They're enormous, and their feet are almost like the thickness of my wrist. Their legs, they've got immense power. Incredible bird. It really is the apex predator in the canopy. If the jaguar is the apex species on the ground of a rainforest, the harpy eagle is the apex in the canopy.
Would a harpy eagle take a human?
No, they wouldn't take a human. No, they do get into conflict with farmers sometimes in these matrix areas where they might have a bunch of chickens or like, small livestock, and they're inquisitive, and they'll certainly come into some of those farmland areas.
You also mentioned the giant anteater, which has been successfully reintroduced in Iberá and other parts of Argentina by the team at Rewilding Argentina. And in fact, this species has made headlines in Brazil because it's made its way back into Brazil from those Argentinian rewilding projects. How big is a giant anteater, and what do they do? And is it conceivable that you could reintroduce those as well?
I think we could, yeah. We know we had them, just over 20 years ago. But it's amazing how quickly species slip from people's minds. That's what's quite shocking to me. But they're huge, They're like, they stand a meter tall, and they're a couple of meters long. But they can rear up on their hind legs, and with those huge front, digging claws, they can impale a jaguar as well. And that's partly why they were made extinct. They got into conflict with like miners and farmers' dogs. They would often kill them, so then the farmers would shoot them. So I'd love to see them back. I mean, they go through and excavate, these huge underground leafcutter ant nests. I've seen them with their heads shoved down in a leafcutter ant nest in the Amazon, just like digging these things up. So they're a control of ants, basically. And we still have a couple of anteaters. We have this tiny little thing called a pygmy anteater that's, could fit in the palm of my hand, that's highly arboreal. And then there's one called a tamandua, which is kind of a medium size, this big. So neither of those compare to the size and scale of a giant anteater, and probably can't replace its impact in any way or its function in the system. The challenge for us is, where would we get animals from? So we obviously need to find, relatively close stocks to put Central American anteaters ideally back into Central America. And it's a completely different type of environment than the team did in Iberá. We're talking about dense tropical rainforest, and there we're looking at like kind of more open grassland systems. So it's great that we've got that example of doing that successfully with that species, but it's never been done in this kind of ecosystem before. But it would be fantastic to do.
So where will you get these species from? Would neighbouring countries be able to provide giant anteaters, harpy eagles, white-lipped peccaries, and so on?
Well, the peccaries is much easier because we've still got them in Corcovado, so it's more of a translocation, and that's why we've chosen to kind of start by pushing that project, because bureaucratically it's much simpler and straightforward, and I think it hopefully will give us a quick win and help, convince people in Costa Rica generally and the government that this is a great thing to do, and build a success story off the back of that. The harpies, there are good populations in Darien in Panama, and also probably in the Mosquitia to the north of us. So there are good populations of harpy eagles. The giant anteater is a bit trickier. They're probably in Darien.
Andy, we've talked a lot about the forest and the animals that we want to bring back to it. What about the Pacific coast? What's in the sea? What's the state of marine mammal populations, fish, and so on?
It's an amazing place. So you've got this high energy coastline, and our beaches, where our property has about 6 kilometers of nesting beaches for sea turtles. And we get like 4 species that use those beaches to nest. We'll get mostly it's olive ridleys, then you'll get some green turtles, some hawksbills, and every now and then you'll get a leatherback in kind of small numbers. And it's just incredible to watch these mother turtles come out onto the beach, lay their nest and then go off again. And we just tagged one of these olive ridleys. We put a satellite transmitter in, I think it was in November, so just like 3 months ago. And she just arrived last week in the Galapagos Islands. She went up to Guanacaste and then went down to Panama and just took off out into the deep ocean, went way past Cocos and arrived in the Galapagos. So she's probably down there feeding up and having a good time, and who knows, hopefully we'll see her again in the next season. But it really gives you a sense of the space that these marine animals need to move. And we know that with there's a great group down here called Mission Tiburon who work with sharks, and they've done some really good tracking studies with hammerhead sharks and tiger sharks that they've tagged in the Gulf of Dulce, and they travel all the way out to the Galapagos Islands. And the reason why they come back to our coastline is they come to give birth. So we have in the peninsula one of only 4 tropical fjords in the world. So in around August, September time is a great time to come down and see the humpback whales inside the Gulf of Dulce giving birth. And so they're there with their calves, and it's just amazing. There's whale sharks that go in there usually around March and April in pretty low numbers, but you can see them in there. And it's a spectacle.
Costa Rica is an incredible story, really. I mean, when you think that pretty much every country in the world is losing ecosystems, some cases quite rapidly, and Costa Rica has so comprehensively bucked the trend. I mean, what did we say earlier? From kind of 20-ish% forest cover up to mid-50s%. That's an enormous change in the landscape. Now, I've seen it with my own eyes when I visited Costa Rica. In some places, you go to the higher ground and you can see secondary forest as far as the eye can see. And when you get down into it, you can see the kind of ghostly shapes of former fences and the kind of the fields sort of dissolving into the landscape. And you can see that these cattle ranches have been reclaimed by forest. And yet they're still full of people. Now, the people seem enormously proud of the transformation that's taken place. A lot of them that had cattle ranches are now on much smaller areas of land growing fruit and veg for the local market. And there seems to be a kind of hive of human activity that takes place in this re-emergent forest. I mean, even the motto of Costa Rica has been changed to pura vida, and everyone says pura vida, pure life. You literally say good morning to someone and they reply with pura vida, which to me seemed like a reflection of the joy people take in the restoration of nature. So does that make your life easier as a rewilder in Costa Rica that's looking to repopulate these recovering protected landscapes with species that have been missing for a while? Do you think it's easier than it might be for us here in Britain, for example, where there are much more culturally entrenched attachments to the agricultural sprawl that we see everywhere?
You would think so, but I do think that, and I don't want to diminish Costa Rica's success because it is unique and it's incredible what they've done in terms of the forest cover turnaround. But it's kind of like a partial success story, and they're very skilled at green marketing. And Costa Rica is a fantastic place that anybody should visit to kind of see that transformation. But there are some things that kind of go a little bit more unnoticed. Like Costa Rica is the biggest user of pesticides per capita in the world. And that's because there's still a lot of use of monoculture in the country in terms of banana. Pineapple is a huge threat and a big pesticide use because everybody in Europe and the US wants a $2 pineapple. And that's pretty a scary expansion of what we're seeing right now. And that's worse than these like mixed use cattle farms where there's, some tree cover. When they plant pineapples, it's like it's worse than oil palm. It's like just a desolate wasteland of pesticide. So they're still struggling with this agricultural landscape because it is still a key part of their industry. And obviously the international market pressures kind of drive this demand for these monocultures. So there's still that kind of battle going on. And I think any time that you're trying to do something that's new and proactive on the front foot, it's kind of alarming for both communities to have something new happen, and the same for the national parks, funnily enough. They kind of see their jobs as maintaining the status quo and not really thinking about, building the types of ecosystems we want back in the future. And so it's still tough to bring some of that progressive thinking. Like I'm sure it was tough for the people who were thinking about the payment for ecosystem service schemes 30, 40 years ago. I'm sure there was a lot of pushback at that time. And now it looks like it was an easy, good idea that got pushed through pretty easily. I'm sure it wasn't then.
Yeah. One of the most exquisite and strange, mysterious ecosystems that I saw when I was in Costa Rica is the cloud forest. I went up to a place called Monteverde, and it rained a lot of the time. When it wasn't raining, it was misty, and in the early evening, the place was just alive with the singing of different frogs. We were taken by someone from the hotel with a torch to look at these creatures, vivid colors of these frogs on the vegetation all around us. And that's an ecosystem that I think overlaps quite well with kind of pineapple and other horticulture and so on. It seemed quite threatened when we arrived, and when we left that part of Costa Rica, we saw agricultural sprawl right through the forest, even though cloud forest is probably Costa Rica's most precious ecosystem. So is that the part of Costa Rica that needs the most attention, would you say, when it comes to conservation, protection, restoration?
I do think that, yeah, the kind of climate where it grows, you're right, is it kind of fits really nicely in these kind of central valley systems. And so that's where we're seeing the big sprawl of it. But it's the biggest threat to me with cloud forests really is kind of climate change. So you've got, as things are kind of shifting, there's really nowhere to go once you get near the top. And so there's a great example, actually. So the golden toad was the one famous from Monteverde that was one of the first species ever recorded that went extinct, and that it was pretty well understood that it was due to climate change because its habitat basically disappeared. And so I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. So you've got the agriculture at the bottom edge kind of chipping away and degrading those lower central valleys, and then climate change is pushing away that habitat right at the top there. So yeah, the cloud forests have got a double pressure at both ends, really.
So if people want to visit you in your magical Osa Peninsula, what's the best way to do that? So I sort of imagine that it's easier to reach Nicoya or some of the more developed parts of the coast further up. Mm-hmm. Is Osa accessible to travelers?
It is these days, for sure. It's super easy to do it. I mean, I drove up yesterday and it's like a 7-hour drive down to Osa, and there was a time where you couldn't just drive down and rocking up there. So one of the main towns that we're based out of is this place called Puerto Jimenez. So I could drive it from San Jose in 7 hours. But there's a little flight company, that do these short hops, in 50 minutes, you're from San Jose right down in Puerto Jimenez. So it's super easy these days. And there's a bunch of great eco lodges and places to stay and places to visit. And we have our own campus. So we kind of target people that are just really want to get immersed in nature, more so than maybe the pina coladas. But we have our own place where people can come and kind of sit and eat dinner with field biologists and conservationists and scientists. And we own and manage our own landscape is around 8,000 acres. And we've got some of the most incredible ancient old growth forests you've seen anywhere in the world. I have to when I go down to the Amazon, I probably have to travel 2 or 3 days to see ancient old growth that we have an hour from Puerto Jimenez. And you have these huge cariocar, they call them garlic trees, and they're vast. I can't even, describe the size of these things. And in a lot of Costa Rica, they were cut down for railway sleepers. And so they're gone from many parts of the country.
But they're still there in Osa. So that's helpful to you if people come and visit you. I mean, most of the travelers I saw when I was in Costa Rica were bird watchers and naturalists and so on. It didn't seem a normal tourist place to me. A bit like when I went to Asturias in northern Spain and everyone was wearing kind of camo or khaki on the flight from Gatwick to Oviedo. It was clear that it was a plane full of naturalists. So it's helpful to you if people come and visit Osa.
It is, because that's what's really shaped the turnaround and the pressures on the national parks and the wildlife. So obviously there's always a balance with development, but if it's that kind of nature-loving visitor that really cares about the wildlife and the impact that they're going to leave, there are a bunch of like tour guides and a huge local economy that depends upon people visiting the place. I think what I wouldn't want to see happen in Osa, and sadly it's kind of coming, is the large development of these huge international chains that, you know, you see up in Nicoya in the north. And I think that I'd hope that Osa retains that kind of spirit of wilderness that it's always had. I mean, it's essentially like a mini Amazon rainforest, and it's an Amazon rainforest without maybe some of the nasty diseases and things that you would pick up down there. So it's a great baptism for anyone who wants to experience a tropical rainforest and that intense biodiversity, but maybe where you can still wear shorts and t-shirt.
Andy Whitworth, I'm so glad my brother introduced me to you. I'm in awe of the work you and your team are doing in that part of Costa Rica. I'm just kind of in love with and in awe of Costa Rica itself. You know, it's, in terms of setting an example for the world on the restoration of nature. It may not be perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we see elsewhere. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk me through your work. I really hope I can visit you one day.
I hope so. Yeah, thanks for having me on the cast, and yeah, please do bring the family down and come and spend some time with us in the Osa, and I'll take you up one of those giant 40-meter trees.
What a pleasure it was to talk to Andy Whitworth, who's made his way all the way from England to Costa Rica, where he's leading a really extraordinary rewilding effort in a country that's among the best in the whole world on the restoration of nature. If you've enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed making it with Andy, please give us a like, spread the word on whatever platform that you use to get your podcasts. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Anton Wolfhart from BirdLife South Africa. Anton and his team are putting together an ambitious plan to rid Marion Island in the Southern Ocean, part of South Africa, of invasive vertebrates, specifically mice, which are eating up the eggs and the babies of the seabirds that once lived there in enormous numbers, but which have been dramatically diminished in recent years. If they pull it off, it'll be one of the great rewilding and restoration stories of our time.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.